institution.
When you say it's loading, is it because your internet's not working, or is it?
Okay.
Okay.
Don't see I think that's okay now.
Okay.
I mean,
Yeah.
so I don't know. I'm gonna.
Yes.
Yeah.
You need to read yourself.
And there is no.
It is muted. Unmute myself.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. No, it's muted.
Merton.
It's unmuted.
Okay.
But in terms of regulation.
Ready? Have we got the right setting on the channel?
They are leaving. Yeah.
Hello, everyone. I think we're going to get started now. Thanks, everyone, so much for coming. On behalf of Merton College, welcome. Thank you for coming on a sunny day, all the way across these tempting gardens to come into a dark room and talk about Colombia and the prospects and challenges for peace. My name is Gwen. I'm a junior research fellow here in Anthropology, and I'm going to be chairing today's discussion. I'm extremely grateful to be able to co-host this event together with the Colombian Society, and thanks to Alejandro Posada, who's here, the chair of the society, who's co-hosting with us. And also, I'm wearing two hats today because, as well as being part of Merton College, I also belong to the other convening organization, which is Rodemos el Diálogo, or Embrace Dialogue, a Colombian peace-building organization with members across the world, about 100 members across the world, who are committed to trying to find a negotiated solution to the armed conflict in Colombia and to building peace through a culture of dialogue. And also, thanks, Andre, very grateful to be co-hosting it together with the University of Winchester Center on Religion, Reconciliation and Peace. So it's been a collaboration to get everyone here today. And we have an absolutely stellar panel. I feel very privileged to be chairing such inspiring speakers who I will be introducing in a moment. But first, I just want to mention the 6 principles of Rodemos el Diálogo for a constructive and peace-building dialogue, which we hope to implement today in our discussion. The first one is respect for the ideas of the other. The second is generosity. We want to be here and give the best of ourselves and of our time today. The third is solidarity, which is, in particular, when we're talking about the challenges for peace building, an important principle to stand ourselves in solidarity with those who've suffered the conflict and its atrocities. The fourth principle is co-responsibility, and because we believe that everyone has a role to play in building peace, and that includes academics and policymakers and practitioners. The fifth principle is self-criticism, because sometimes in academia we think we are right about stuff, but actually it's very difficult to see the world, especially as complex a problem as peace building, from any kind of objective perspective. And so we can only ever see one small view of something, and we are always willing, when we come along to a dialogue, to be willing to revise our views when confronted with new information or new ways of seeing. And the sixth principle, I'm missing one, Andre. Okay. Generosity, respect, honesty. I did co-responsibility. Oh God, this is embarrassing.
Support from a colleague.
Well, we'll have to find out, or maybe create a new one along the way. Anyway, those are the principles that we'll be following today. And just by way of opening comments before I introduce the panel, the reason we're having this discussion today is because, of course, as many of you will know, a new government, the government of Gustavo Petro, took power in Colombia last year in August 2022. After 4 years of a government under President Ivan Duque, who had campaigned against the peace process with the FARC guerrilla, many civil society organizations, including Rodemos el Diálogo, saw Petro's government as a renewed opportunity for peacemaking. And Petro has an ambitious policy for peace, which he's called Total Peace, which we'll be taking stock of today, including the implementation of the peace accord with the FARC guerrilla signed in 2016, peace talks with the remaining guerrilla group, the ELN, the National Liberation Army, some form of negotiated solution, I'm not sure whether it's right to call them peace talks or not, with the other armed groups who range from FARC dissidents to criminal gangs, and of course, all sorts of major structural reforms which seek to redress the inequalities in the country and prevent future spirals of violence. But this is not an easy task. So today, to discuss the advances and challenges of total peace in Colombia, we have 4 fantastic speakers. We have, first of all, Professor Jenny Pierce, who's research professor in Latin American and Caribbean Centre at the London School of Economics and has been researching Colombia for several decades and has seen it through various peace processes. Ivan Briscoe, who is the Latin American Caribbean Director for International Crisis Group. Dr. Andre Gomez Suarez, who's a senior research fellow at the Centre for Religion, Reconciliation and Peace at the University of Winchester. And Dr. Jeremy Hobbs, who's a research analyst on Latin America in the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. So the way this is going to work is I'm first of all going to ask each of them an opening question for them to set on the table some opening remarks. And I know it's very difficult to address in just a maximum of 10 minutes each, some very brief outlining perspectives on the prospects for peace under Petro. But then after this initial round of questions, I might have 1 or 2 very short follow-up questions for you, or depending on how we're doing to time, we'll go otherwise straight to you, because I think it will be really valuable to have a discussion where our experts can respond to your interests and your questions and your comments. We are live streaming this event for you to be aware on our YouTube channel, on the Rodamos el Diálogo YouTube channel, so it will be available afterwards. It is recording us, so they can't see you, but they can see us. Any questions that you ask will be recorded, but they will not be seeing you, they will just be hearing you, for you to be aware. So if you're not comfortable being recorded, your question, then perhaps save it for the drinks afterwards, because we will be following our panel with a drinks reception in the lobby straight after the event. So, and just brief housekeeping, the toilets are through there, and if there's a fire alarm, it's a real one, so we'll go out the way we came, please. Okay, we'll start off, I think, with Jenny. As I mentioned, Jenny has been studying Colombia and seen it go through many periods of conflict and peacemaking attempts and many efforts to end the armed conflict, which is full of challenges. How do you see the significance of the Petro government and its total peace policy?
Thank you, Gwen. And I won't lose my 10 minutes by making a lot of thank yous, but thank you. This is extremely important to start a discussion about Petro's total peace, not just for Colombia, where it is really important, obviously, but I think there's a global interest in this. When I was at Manchester Station, now I just come down from the north, I bought a copy of the New Statesman because it had a very interesting sort of headline about the end of the liberal delusion. And when I read the articles in it, one of them, the editorial said, in this new era, there is no place for utopian projects to remake the world or ideological fantasies. So it made me think about where we place Petro's total peace. Is it a utopian project and or an ideological fantasy, out of touch with the new post-liberal global order? Or does that global order make it difficult to do what it wants to do? Or are we talking about the deep challenges of change in a country that has gone through so much violences and war? So you know the basics, I think, but just to make sure we're on the same page, I think one of the obviously key issues about what Gustavo Petro is trying to do is he wants peace to be a state project, a project of the state. That's extremely interesting, right? And he's looking to negotiate with all armed actors, from those understood as holding on to political goals to those whose main aim seems to be a legal accumulation. And that distinction itself is incredibly complex, as I'm sure we'll be talking about. And that's not to mention the complexity of the differences that exist between the dissident FARC groups that signed the peace accord and the one that abandoned it, and the Estado Mayor group that never signed it. And in addition, there are complex battles going on in various parts of Colombia between and within different groups. So there's a lot of complexity to this discussion. But what I wanted to start off by reflecting on is, because there's so much difficulty in Colombia at the moment, I've just come back, in terms of sort of thinking, where is the debate? Where's the serious debate? What is the debate that is about resistance to change? Where is it coming from? And it felt important to sort of ask ourselves, first of all, from what positioning are we analysing Petro? From what sort of sense of what we imagine he is trying to do are we looking at his positions? And so keeping up with the responses to total peace in Colombia is actually extremely difficult. And because also of the regions, as everyone knows, I'll be talking a little bit about my experiences in Medellin in a minute. But there are very different responses in the country, according to whether you are part of what we might call, and I'm working on this a lot, I don't use the word loosely, economic, political, technocratic elites. Politically, both Uribe and Santos, the previous presidents of the are conscious of their own role in history. And in contributing, Uribe feels he contributed to security as peace. He took the country from the paramilitary groups he was supporting at one point with the help of Plan Colombia, strength of the military. I've just talked with people from the Centro Democrático Party, and they feel Uribe's historical role in contributing to peace is extremely important. That's the lens of which he's analysing, and the Centro Democrático is analysing what is going on. And then former President Santos, right? He didn't achieve the express peace he wanted to do. He obviously achieved something of great importance, the Accord of 2016. But at the end of the day, we know that there was a limit to the agenda of change that he wanted to put on the agenda in the Havana talks. So it was, in one sense, a pragmatic peace. You could perhaps argue that Uribe's was an armed peace, but both have proved very problematic in the implementation. And it's interesting to recognize that the key figures in the Havana Accord, Humberto de la Calle and Sergio Cardinillo, are both strong opponents of what Gustavo Petro is doing. So that raises some questions in itself. And then there are many other responses that come from different perspectives to what's going on. So other economic and elite actors, some of those we're analysing at the moment exactly which sectors of the elites in the economy actually supported the 2016 agreement. And it seems like some did, but they did wanting the demobilization of the FARC, but weren't sort of imagining that that was going to involve a hell of a lot of other changes and deep structural changes in the country. So it was demobilize, but not necessarily of the FARC, but not necessarily think, how do you build the peace? So we've now got a lot of those elites coming out very strongly against everything that Petro is doing. We then have the media, owned by many of those elites. And actually, there's a deep hostility in the mainstream media. So it's difficult to get a sort of sense from that media as to exactly, on the grounds for which the opposition is coming from. And then talking to citizens of Colombia, you get a lot of confusion. And obviously, a lot depends on where you're located, whether you're urban, rural, whether you are poor, middle class, wealthy. And as I said, I've just been in Medellin, and there are communities who struggled in the midst of various violences for decades and live with extortion and threat. I've been in the comunas of Medellin just recently, and some of them like the idea of total peace, because yes, who wouldn't want total peace? But they can't really believe it could ever be implemented. There's a sense of mistrust that this can ever actually happen. And then there are others who've actually on the ground been trying to build peace in Medellin for a long time. And they ask, why are our peace efforts not recognized in this total peace? Why is it that the comisionado is coming to Togui prison, but he's actually not talking to us? So you've got those responses. And then in the same city, there are divisions over whether you can actually engage with the local gangs or combos, how you should engage with the more organized Oficina de Envigado, or the more powerful Clan del Golfo, all very important groups, but all quite different in the city. That's again the complexity of Medellin. And for instance, as I talked to someone who was part of a combo, a group in the 80s, then went to prison in the 90s. He's now set up an organization in which he's saying, look, we also are citizens, those of us who actually are in these groups. So we should be looked upon as political actors. We are all political actors. We want not a law of submission, which is the of sometimiento, which is being proposed by the Petro government. We want a law of acogimiento. We want actually to be brought into this process as political actors. But then you talk to other NGOs in Medellin, and they will say you cannot conflate the Clan del Golfo or Envigado with the ELN or with other political groups. So even at that level of just one city, an important city, you have tremendous differences and difficulties in sort of buying into all of this. And then what about academics? There is an absolute range of opinions around amongst academics in Colombia about how to look at it and what lens to use to look at it. Do we look at the total peace from a realist political science perspective? Do we look at it from the perspective of history? Do we use an anthropological sensibility? Or do we bring a normative peace studies commitment to try and understand what Petro is trying to do? I felt I needed to problematize these lenses because I think whether you see it as a utopian vision or an essential step in the transformation of the country, so much depends on where you are situated, on the lens in which you bring to this discussion. That it's incredibly important to reflect on what you're bringing to your discussion and your analysis. And it should always be remembered that Colombia is, as well as all the history of violence, I'm sure many of you know, Colombians here know, it's a country of extraordinary creativity. And Medellin itself, you know, has this history of violence, etc. It also has the most amazing poetry festival every year. And I was struck by Gonzalo Sanchez, a very important academic, historian of violence in Colombia, in a recent piece in El Espectador, in which he said, the thing about Colombia is it's both insumisa y conformista. In other words, it's unsubmissive and it's also conformist at the same time. And so you have, I think, in the sort of just the situation of the country, a hell of a lot of different difficulties in actually getting a common analysis and understanding on top of all the trauma, the difficulties that people live. So looking at my own lens, right? What lens do I bring? I think we all have to ask the question. So I consider myself a political scientist, but I also studied history, but I use anthropological methods in my research. And I consider myself at some level an anthropologist of peace. So my lens is to basically argue we need all these lenses, and there's many lenses I lack. I lack an economics lens, for instance. But I think we have to look at all of this because Petro's reforms that are connected to total peace, but apparently not, actually are very connected. So we've got at the moment a real, very difficult debate on all the other reforms he's trying to do. And people might ask, well, where exactly is the connection? He's trying to do so much at once. That's one of the big questions that are raised about Petro. I'm also deeply committed to the possibility of a politics without violence. And that's a normative, as well as I would argue, realizable project. And that for me is what I'm seeing in the vision around Petro's proposals. I think the breadth of his vision actually is significant and vital. In a country where we've had these selective approaches, one based on militarized security first, another limited reforming agendas, but they have not addressed the deeply embedded inequalities, which without addressing it's hard to believe that you will reduce violences. But having just talked to the right in Colombia, they don't believe that actually inequality and poverty is connected to the violences of the country. So there is a real issue. They're very influenced by Paul Collier, in fact, who comes from Oxford, and the greed and grievous debate. And so they believe actually there's an awful lot here about basic greed, and it's not about injustice or poverty. So we have a basic problem in that analysis. So I think there's a great deal to sort of think about, but Petro, what he's done is trying to get us to think about the bigger issues that lie behind the violences. However, of course, he's taken up a big agenda. He can't talk about reducing violences without talking about the drugs issue. He can't control totally the drugs issue, and he's tried to make that and relate it to global issues. While violence and illicit accumulation are routes to status and life, even though a short one, particularly for young men, it is difficult to imagine peace in Colombia without addressing something about not just drugs, but there are also all kinds of other illicit routes to illicit accumulation. So the challenge then is how to politically manage extending the reforms to these broader issues, overcoming the resistances and building a new democratic vision of the country with violence reduction at its heart. That's a huge, huge agenda. The vision, I would say then, is something it's really important we discuss. We don't dismiss it as a utopia. It matters, this vision that he's putting out there. The implementation is something else. That is an extremely challenging issue. And I'm finishing now, just half a minute, right? The great challenge for him is that the traditional way in which a president might bring about his agenda in Colombia would be to do deals in Congress with politicians, offering them posts, the so-called mermelada. And this first period of Petro's government has shown that that's not going to work, right? And of course, as we know, he has just sacked his cabinet and brought in a whole lot of actors, and I'm sure we'll be discussing this. Petro, on the 1st of May, just Monday, announced that he's really looking to how he can mobilize the poor, right, and the working people. And that's a big issue. The implementation, will that be essential, and can that be done without violence again? So it is true, I think, that total peace is probably not thought out in its implementation in the detail that a lot of people, a lot of academics would like. They've criticized it a lot. It didn't come with a baked plan. Should he have prioritized, many asked, the actual implementation of the 2016 Accord, right? Made that his first task and then looked at the broader aspects. However, he's trying to argue with the vision that actually you can't even implement that 2016 agreement unless you start to talk about all the other reforms the countries need. And of course, the agrarian reform was the first one of the 2016 agenda, and that's one very important, but only one of his agenda at the moment. So the problem is, of course, that by offering to extend these reforms, he's going to get much more of a backlash. So I think the case for Petro's Paz Total is very strong. His reforming agenda in Colombia is needed. Whether he has the political capacity and leadership qualities to bring society behind it despite the opposition will be the big question. And I think what worries me is what happens if he fails.
Wow, well, thank you so much, Jenny. What an amazing overview in such a short time. Thank you. I think you raised really important questions about the importance of looking at Petro's vision, because a vision matters, and that we should also not necessarily analyze it through the lens that we have been analyzing previous peace policies, but try to see it for what it is, where it comes from, and also to deconstruct the many lenses we can use to look at it to try to understand what he's trying to do, rather than coming at it with pre-packaged ideas that we might have brought from previous peace processes, either in Colombia or elsewhere. Ivan, you've been studying Colombia and visiting Colombia for a very long time also, and International Crisis Group has been doing really important work on the ground, monitoring the conflict and peace process. How do you see the security challenges right now in Colombia that the total peace policy has to deal with, and including there's a new security policy, which is kind of part of this overarching vision? What do you make of that?
Thank you very much, Gwen. Thank you, everybody on the panel. Thank you for coming here today. I'm going to start off with a little bit of the politics and then go into the security, because I'd like to position Petro within Latin America. And I think that's absolutely crucial, because he sees himself as a Latin American leader as well, not just as president of Colombia. And Latin America is in a very interesting political configuration at the moment. The story we all know is that it's moved left. Obviously, almost every South American country is now a left-wing government, but it's also a region where the radicalized right is knocking on the door constantly. It's just been turfed out of power in Brazil. Petro only lost by 3% or so to a very right-wing, well, we could say right, with outsider candidate last year. And of course, at the end of this year, we're going to have elections in Argentina where we might see the first hard right libertarian candidate taking power. And of course, we have the other, perhaps most well-known, in a sense, renowned politician in Latin America at the moment is a populist from Central America called Nayib Bukele. who's actually at the other extreme when it comes to security policy from Petro. So this is the landscape Petro finds himself in. But Petro, according to a senior Western diplomat I was speaking to last week, was saying he is leading the most radical democratic government, not just in Colombia, but in Latin America for decades. Radical and democratic. I think that's an important combination, and security policy is right at the heart of it. But the problem is with all radical projects in Latin America, the outcomes, the methods he chooses, and the nature of his opposition are all uncertain and in development. He came to power in 2022 on the basis fundamentally of two constituencies in Colombia and two fundamental pitches, political pitches, if you like. He won in the big cities. 4 out of 5 of Colombia's biggest cities went to Petro, and he won in the most conflict-affected areas, particularly the Atlantic coast and the Pacific coast. His appeal was on the basis of two things: fighting inequality. Colombia is the second most unequal country in Latin America after Brazil, and fighting or changing the patterns of conflict and violence, which have, of course, plagued Colombia since, well, you might say since the 1950s, you might say since independence in the early 19th century. These concerns had reached a crescendo in 2021 as the pandemic was raging across the country. Protests engulfed Colombia for 2 months. There were a range of different issues which were involved, but a fundamental part of it was the criticism of the dominant economic model in the country. But another part of it was the failure of Ivan Duque's government at the time to improve the security conditions in the country. Although he had come to power from the right as a disciple of this former president Álvaro Uribe, promising a tough hand to correct what he regarded as the flaws of the peace agreement of 2016. His deployment of the military, forced eradication programs, and other such strategies only led to a worsening of security conditions across the country. Dramatic humanitarian emergencies, killing of social leaders, hundreds of which were killed during his government, rises in a pattern of forced confinement, which is when armed groups oblige communities to stay within their own localities and not move. And of course, booming coca crops. The man who declared time and time again, menos coca, más paz, less coca, more peace, was at the end of his administration only able to deliver the largest coca crops ever recorded in the history of Colombia, and a declining state of peace. So Petro's total peace is born out of a reading of the situation which Ivan Duque left in 2022. Obviously, Colombia has seen constant conflict over the last few decades in different forms, and a whole series of different attempts to negotiate a way out of that conflict. Yet what's interesting, I think, about Petro's attempt is that it combines two curiously contradictory facets. One is its ambition, total peace, historical transformation of the country, and the other is its extreme realism, because it's all about talking with the armed groups and the criminal groups at every single level and trying to accept the reality on the ground. Petro and his main allies in this project, Danilo Rueda, the High Commissioner for Peace, Ivan Cepeda, the Senator, even Foreign Minister Álvaro Leiva, are all veterans of peace processes over the years. Álvaro Leiva, in particular, who's in his mid-80s at the moment. And they have a particular reading of what has happened in recent years and why the FARC peace accord, which was in many ways the most articulate, best planned, most rigorously prepared document to deal with Colombia's tendency to violence, has seemed to, well, if not failed, at least not fulfilled its ambitions. Why is that? Why was that the case? Well, I think one of their understandings is that the military strategy failed because the groups no longer involved are no longer fighting the state as such. They're no longer insurgent forces. They're no longer guerrillas, but are much more concerned by criminal revenues And to gain and secure criminal revenues, they require control over communities. Their principal target is to control and discipline communities to ensure territory rather than fight the state. So when the state attacks those criminal groups, the criminal groups or armed groups don't fight the state back. They don't lead to multiple attacks or combat. There are asymmetric attacks, but combat in the variety which we saw before. But in fact, it seeks to discipline, even in more harsh means, the communities under their control. I think the second element, and this is obviously a valid reflection from the last few years, is that you can't make peace with just one group, since all the others will seek to take the place of the group which is negotiating peace and maybe going to demobilize. You have an array of armed groups. You have the largest criminal group at the moment, the Gulf Clan. If you do not negotiate with the Gulf Clan, then the National Liberation Army, the FARC dissidents, and all the other smaller groups are going to think, well, if we give up our arms, who's going to come and take the place? Only this group, which represents in some ways some of the more violent and in some ways politically, heirs of a politically right-wing paramilitary movement from 20 years ago. And I think the third thing which they question, perhaps not explicitly, but I think it is very present, is one of the standard interpretations of what's gone wrong in Colombia over the last 2 or 3 decades. Colombia, you always hear from civil society, from government officials, from the international community, needs more state presence. This might sound a little bit odd in English, but this is a direct translation from the Spanish. The sense that large parts of Colombia where the state is not present, it doesn't operate, it doesn't provide public services, and armed groups come in and take its place. I think what the Total Peace constituency recognizes is that this is desirable, that this is the long-term ambition, but it's highly problematic to achieve it in Colombia. The Peace Accord of 2016 laid out a huge plan for occupying the territory left behind by the FARC guerrillas once they had demobilized. It was called Plan Victoria. It involved the deployment of 70,000 troops. It was supposed to mobilize all the different parts of the state in a combined civil military operation. It didn't happen. And there are fundamental reasons why the Colombia state is not able to reach those areas. And I think Petro and obviously his allies in government understand that to an extent. Now, I'm going to maybe drop off a little bit of some of the details about total peace and security policy, because I know that Jenny's already touched on them. I just want to say that in the security document, the security policy plan, which came out last week. Last week was a very busy week in Colombia, as we said. We'll come to that later. This plan came out, and the minister who presented it, Defense Minister Ivan Velasquez, wrote in the preface, and I thought this is interesting what he said: the will to peace, the government's will to peace, cannot be confused with the weakness of the state, and even less so with the naivety of the government. I think these are fairly defensive words. There's an understanding that what the criticism of the total peace policy is that it represents a fundamental surrender to the interests of armed and criminal groups. But that's not necessarily the case. It all depends a little bit on the way it is done in practice. And I think there are 3 issues which maybe will determine whether total peace reaches those goals or not. And I'll just point to them now. I've got 1 minute, so they're going to be very quick indeed. Can negotiations end the armed designs of fundamentally or partially criminalized groups? i.e., does total peace enact a pax mafiosi, or does it de-escalate a conflict and then lead the way to a final end of that conflict? And this is a crucial issue. If it's a pax mafiosi, of course, you're making an arrangement with criminal groups so that they lower their violence in exchange for greater control over communities. They effectively run communities. If it's de-escalation, you're reducing violence with an aim to change in the conditions which generate violence and armed violence over the years. And of course, that raises the issue as how serious are we to take the plans for economic transformation in rural areas, the plans for changing the addiction to coca growing amongst certain landless peasants who are in certain areas, or to actually bringing the state in a way that has never been achieved before. Two other issues very quickly. Petro's radical lurch over the last few days. I think that's the only way we can describe it. He's given two speeches over the last week. One last week in Zarzal, that Valle de Cauca, isn't it? When he said that he would call himself a government in emergency. He said that the offer from the Ranchers Association for selling land had been nowhere near satisfactory, that they required a much more aggressive way to achieve certain key goals for peace, such as land redistribution. And then just on Monday, when he gave a speech, he did from the balcony of the presidential palace, he said social change implies a permanent struggle, and that struggle happens with a mobilized people. He used the expression mobilized people again and again. What exactly is the technique he's going to use to overcome opposition? Does seem to be calling on people to go to the streets, and the issue of land and redistribution of land is going to be absolutely crucial to that campaign. And lastly, of all, and the third point, I think, which raises issues about the future of total peace and what it might mean, is the Latin American region, the neighborhood in which Colombia finds itself. Colombia's armed groups have spread over borders. The more criminal groups are part of transnational chains, obviously involving drug trafficking and migrant smuggling. We have seen the effects on neighbors of the peace process, particularly the effect on Ecuador, which is recording its highest rates of violence in its history at the moment. We've also seen the effects on Colombia of what's happened in neighboring countries. And I'm thinking particularly the role of Venezuela now of hosting a large part of certain of the armed groups, the National Liberation Army in particular. It's also important to think about Panama, the Darien Gap. As you may have heard, this area of land between Colombia and Panama is now one of the main channels for migrants going north to the United States. An estimated 400,000 migrants are going to pass through that funnel of land, which is a swampy tropical jungle, basically, over the year. And that area is entirely controlled by the Gulf clan, who charge $100 or more to each migrant who goes through. It's very simple to do that maths. That's a lot of money. And that is a problem shared between Panama, Colombia, and the United States. So these raise issues about how regional dynamics are going to affect total peace itself. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ivan. And I realize I've given you impossible tasks trying to respond to such big questions. And obviously you have so much interesting information. It would be lovely to give you more time. But I think this is putting some really important issues on the table to get this conversation started. And I think it's really important to have a look at all of those different characteristics of the armed group problem in Colombia as being so multiplex, and this criminality, structures of criminality which go from transnational drug trafficking groups to people who are involved in corruption in totally illicit economies within Colombia and even beyond its borders too. So it's a very multiform, complex problem that drives the security challenge. Andre, as well as being researcher who has been studying Colombia for many years and is at the University of Winchester, is also co-founder of Podemos el Diálogo and is very in touch with a lot of the civil society organizations in Colombia who have been campaigning for peace for many years, both through the Santos Peace Administration and keeping the mobilization for peace alive during the Duque years when it was under threat. And perhaps many of that sort of effervescence from civil society has kept alive peace and has led to the election of a president who is promising peace. This obviously made a lot of organizations like Podemos el Diálogo optimistic at the beginning. There was a surge of expectations, but of course a lot of people at the beginning of Petro's presidency also talked about the expectations being too high and Petro not being able to deliver on them, and citizen dissatisfaction would shortly follow. How do you see the achievements of Petro's government so far in this materia?
Thank you, Gwen, and it's a great pleasure to be here in this panel and, be able to share some
Make
thoughts
sure
with-
you're speaking loud enough because we're not using microphones.
Yeah, okay, share some thoughts with Jenny and with Ivan and with Jeremy. I mean, tremendous challenge already. But so I don't know if I'm gonna be able to give you the whole picture that I want to give you. So at least I'm gonna try to show you first the roadmap that I'm gonna take and see if I don't have the opportunity to finish in the 10 minutes, I will, at least you will know where I was heading. First, I want to do a very quick historical note in order to try to think about the achievements of Petro. Then I want to move into 4 specific areas to try to see at those achievements. First, to discuss a bit of what he has achieved in terms of the illegal armed groups that are active in Colombia after the peace agreement in 2016. Then I want to just discuss some achievements in terms of gangs and prisons. Then I want to just mention a couple of points in terms of what he has done in regards of the implementation of the peace agreement. And finally, try to talk about the participation of civil society. I think, and I've called this in different articles, in peace building, and it's a total paradigm shift. He's combining bottom-up and top-down approaches of peace building. So let me just start with this quick historical overview. If we think about what he has achieved in 9 months, we need to look back to the last 40 years of peace processes in Colombia. Betancourt, the president between 1982 and 1986, set up a peace commission in 1983, a year after he was in government, and he could only achieve an agreement with the FARC to start a formal peace process in 1984, 2 years after. Then President Barco, president between 1986 and 1990, actually stopped the peace process that was going with the FARC, and he didn't carry out negotiation only towards the end of his presidency in 1989. So it took him 3 years to start negotiations with the M19, a different guerrilla group. Cesar Gaviria, president between 1990 and 1984, started negotiations with the ELN and the FARC in 1992, 2 years after he started his presidential term. President Samper, between 1994 and 1998, had not peace process at all. For 4 years, he could not start peace processes. Pastrana, president between 1988 and 2002, who was elected on the peace ballot because he took himself a picture with Tiro Fijo, started peace negotiations with the FARC in January 1999. So it took him more than 5 months. Uribe, president between 2002 and 2010, invited paramilitary groups to start negotiations in November 2002, and actually he could only start the negotiations with them in January 2003. President Juan Manuel Santos, the most successful one so far, according to many people, took 2 years to start formal peace negotiations with the FARC in Havana, Cuba, and it took him 4 years to start formal peace negotiations with the ELN in Quito, Ecuador. Duque destroyed the peace process with the ELN within 4 months of his presidential administration. Petro started peace or formal peace negotiations with the ELN in November 2022. That's only 3 months into his administration. Yesterday, the 3rd round of negotiations with the ELN has just started in Cuba. So let's think a bit more about the illegal armed groups. So what has happened with the ELN is not only that we have had these 3 rounds of negotiations, but he also, the parties, the negotiation parties, carried out a humanitarian rally in San Juan and agreed very specific humanitarian measures to start to be implemented in December this year. They are in this round of negotiations starting to discuss, as we saw yesterday, seriously, a bilateral ceasefire and the agreement on the participation of civil society. In regards to FARC dissident groups that did not sign the peace agreement in 2016, he has already set up with that group a verification and monitoring mechanism with the participation of the monitoring mission of the Organization of American States. And he has asked the United Nations to accompany that monitoring mechanism. This was agreed on the 24th of April this year. He also is about to start a negotiation table with this group in mid-May. So we are talking just within the first 9 months of his administration. In regards to the FARC, who did sign the peace agreement and then went up to take up arms, called the Segunda Marquetalia, what Petro has done is already approaching them, has been discussing with Iván Márquez the possibility of creating a negotiation table, and has offered them a bilateral ceasefire that the Segunda Marquetalia has agreed that is willing to carry it out. The government has somehow, through Leiva, recognized the entrapment of what happened to Iván Márquez and Santrich in the middle of the implementation of the peace agreement. And Minister of Foreign Affairs Leiva has requested the UN Security Council to open a commission of investigation to follow up on those who have been trying to put obstacles to the implementation of the peace agreement. In terms of the paramilitary groups, what is called now the Autodefensas Gaitanistas de Colombia, self-defense groups, or Clan del Golfo, what he has already achieved was he signed a bilateral ceasefire with them, but then he suspended that bilateral ceasefire with them because the paramilitary groups were sponsoring a miners' strike in Bajo Cauca, Antioquia. So at the moment, what he's been doing is using 2 back channels to continue a discussion with the Clan del Golfo to see if they are willing to come back to a negotiation table respecting the ceasefire. And he has also met with the 7 former commanders of the Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, a group that immobilized during the President Uribe administration, to discuss with them what has been the failures of the Just and Peace law that was created to disarm these groups. And we know now that more than 4,000 members of the paramilitary groups were killed in the last 20 years, and that many of the truths that they have been telling to the courts have not been used to dismantle the complicated alliances between politicians and criminal actors in Colombia. So he's trying to say this is an important thing to take forward. And in terms of the Self-Defense Forces Conqueror of Sierra Nevada, that is a small paramilitary group on the north of Colombia, what he's been doing is been talking with some of the commanders to agree a dialogue process about a social judicial mechanism for them to reincorporate into society, at the same time that the Office of the High Commissioner for Peace has been talking to community leaders in the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta to create this as a peace region in which the community organizations can actually take charge of the region. So that's what happened in terms of illegal armed groups. Now, in terms of gangs, the important thing that he has achieved has happened in 3 cities of Colombia: Buenaventura, Medellin, and Quibdó. In terms of Buenaventura, he achieved a really important agreement between the Shotas and Espartanos in November last year that actually has gone through ups and downs. But last week, the groups again said that they have the willingness to maintain the ceasefire between them and to stop hostilities between the groups. In Medellin, last week, we found out that 90% of the gangs organizations are willing to stop hostilities between them and against the security forces. We found out this on the 27th of April. And we know that there is a facilitation process going on between some of these representatives and the Colombian government since February 2023. In Quibdó, 3 armed gangs have been respecting an ongoing ceasefire that started in December 2022. And they continue to keep talks about how they can start a formal negotiation about the reincorporation. In terms of prisons, since November 2022, there has been a peace table set up in the Tramacua in Valledupar, one of the most important prisons in Colombia, in which the 50 of the people who have been there engaged in criminal activities have agreed to stop extortion, and they have agreed that it's going to start a diplomado of culture of peace within the prison to start changing the dynamics within that. In terms of the implementation of the peace agreement, he has, and I'm not going to get into this, but he has made a priority the point 1 that Jenny Pease was talking about. He has given more than, now that the Minister of Agriculture left, she said that gave more than 10,000 hectares back to people. When in the Duque administration, this hadn't happened. In terms of point 2 of the agreement, that is political participation, he has promoted the idea of a national pact, and this has become the central issue of the whole peace, total peace agenda, is we cannot solve this in the negotiation tables. We need to bring the political parties, we need to bring the opposition, we need to do a national pact. And that was included in the peace agreement with the FARC. And of course, he's been working with the National Council for Peace and Reconciliation. In terms of point 3, that is the one of security guarantees for former combatants, he has restarted and reinvigorated the National Commission for Security Guarantees. But also one of the most important things, perhaps, is that he has recognized the importance of a tripartite mechanism that was created with the FARC for the FARC to help find the location of more than 5,000 landmines that have been buried in the ground by them. So that is already in the process of being dismantled. In terms of point 4, President Petro has made it clear through Álvaro Leiva that they are going to call a global conference on drugs. And this is an absolutely fundamental pillar of the peace agreement. And they have focused their efforts in something that the peace agreement asked for to do, that is, instead of punishing the coca growers, do voluntary eradication. And the second thing is focusing on interdiction and the destruction of the illegal economies, not targeting the people. And that's absolutely fundamental. In terms of point 5, the government pushed for the inclusion of the recommendations of the Truth Commission in the National Development Plan that is going to be signed as a law in the next few days. They have been fighting against the opposition who wants to take Article 8, that is the one that makes these recommendations compulsory within the National Development Plan. And in terms of point 6, the president asked the United Nations Security Council to broaden the scope of the UN mission in Colombia, to monitor the implementation of the ethnic chapter that was the one that was really playing behind all the implementation in Colombia, and also reinvigorated the Commission for the Promotion and the Follow-up of the implementation of the peace agreement. Finally, outside of all of this, he created the unit for the implementation of the peace agreement. There is a huge discussion about that. He's saying that he's going to change that and transform it into the institution. So let me finish just mentioning very quickly what has happened in terms of participation of civil society. The main focus of this total peace policy is telling people that they can be the architects of peace and that they are supported by the government to do it. So Petro has been holding regional binding dialogues to create the National Development Plan. His government has participated in 2, at least, humanitarian summits created by humanitarian organizations in Catatumbo and Nariño. He's been meeting with women organizations, and he's been saying that what he's building is a feminist peace. He's reinvigorated the National Council for Reconciliation, that is a unit within civil society that supports the peace policy of the government. And he has participated in some of the Cocalero summits that have been called in Catatumbo. So he's constantly empowering civil society and saying your participation is absolutely fundamental in peace building in Colombia. I will leave it there. And of course, I don't want to talk about the challenges, just
we can get to those, and I'm sure the audience will have many questions about those. Thank you so much, Andre. And just listening to that list of different initiatives to talk to different armed groups, it just shows how challenging the panorama is to have to deal with so many different organizations who all have different modus operandi, different legal status, different, I mean, remembering what Jenny was saying about different academic visions and perspectives, you know, dealing with armed criminal gangs and dealing with guerrilla groups is usually dealt with by completely different academic lenses. And so having to bring them all together under the lens of peace building, really, I think it is a vision. It is a vision that is a holistic vision of the challenges that the violence in Colombia presents. But is it going to be enough? We're going to zoom out now to a broader international perspective and turn to Jeremy, finally. You've been hearing all of this panorama of perspectives on Colombia. What is the UK government's role in the Colombian peace process, and how is the British government seeing Petro and his peace attempts so far?
Yes, thanks, Gwen, and thanks to Merton for the invitation and for organising a fantastic panel on Colombia. And it's been great to listen to those stunning performances there. So just I'll quickly preface my 10-minute presentation by saying what I do in the Foreign Office and what I don't do. So I work in research analysts, which is a specialist cadre of around 60 geographical and thematic experts in the FCDO. We love our acronyms in the Foreign Office, Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. We provide sort of timely, high quality, all source evidence-based research and analysis to FCDO ministers and officials, as well as other government departments across Whitehall. We like to think we offer some intellectual rigor and a long-term perspective. We are sort of an institutional memory in the office. And an independent viewpoint. So we do say things as we see them, even if that sometimes makes us a little bit unpopular with our policy colleagues. So we are not policymakers, but we work very closely with those who make policy in the Foreign Office. And we like to think that we inform and challenge that policy. And one of the ways we do that is by engaging with the real experts in academia and think tanks, NGOs and civil society groups out there looking at Latin America. So Colombia is a key partner for the UK in Latin America, and we do work closely on a broad range of issues. The FCDO minister with responsibility for the Americas and the Caribbean, David Rutley, was in Colombia just last November. He met with the foreign minister, Alvaro Leiva, to discuss a wide range of issues, which included, of course, ongoing UK support for the Colombian peace process. And we hope that there'll be another very high-level FCDO visit to Colombia shortly, hopefully next month. So the historical links between the UK, and it's worth perhaps putting this in a little bit of historical context. So the historical links between the UK and Colombia are strong. They date back, many of you will know, to sort of UK support, British support at the time, to Simon Bolivar's efforts to, and his independence movement 200 years ago. But, for much of the 20th century, bilateral relations were described by a succession of British ambassadors in Bogota as cordial but thin, was a sort of classic phrase. That began to change in the early 1980s, when Colombia was the only Latin American country to publicly condemn Argentina's use of force during the Falklands conflict. And that certainly sort of led Foreign Office officials to sort of sit up and take a little bit more notice of Colombia, particularly because they saw, this was a principled stance, even though Colombia continued to back Argentina's claim to the islands, but they condemned the use of force. And they also sort of were genuinely, I think, impressed by Colombia's macroeconomic stability, its resilience in the face of internal conflict. The result was more attention from British ministers and senior officials across Whitehall. Prime Minister John Major made a landmark visit to Colombia in 1992. That was the first ever visit by a British Prime Minister to South America, and more British trade missions followed. The discovery by BP, then known as British Petroleum, of large oil and gas deposits in Cusiana in the east of Colombia also gave a further boost to UK-Colombia relations. And just stepping back a couple of years, in 1989, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was one of the first Western leaders to respond to an urgent Colombian appeal by President Barco for international support to combat narco-terrorism. And a package of UK anti-drugs assistance was quickly agreed, and the UK has remained a close partner of Colombia on counter-narcotics work ever since. And I think, Andre, you mentioned the emphasis that Petro is putting on interdiction, and that, that plays very much into a UK strength. We're not the only partner, of course. Now, British government support for the peace process in Colombia, or peace processes, dates back over 20 years. The UK played a prominent role in efforts to galvanise international support for President Pastrana's efforts, again, Andre referred to negotiate a deal with the FARC in the late 1990s and early 2000s. The UK hosted an international conference in London and shared Northern Ireland experience. Mo Mowlam, who was the former Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, visited Colombia on, I think, 3 occasions during the Pastrana presidency, met with the president and a whole range of other people, talked a lot about the Northern Ireland peace process. Through the British Embassy in Bogota at the time, the UK also provided direct support to Colombian NGOs and think tanks working on peace-related issues, and to what then was a sort of nascent civil society peace movement. Now, these weren't huge sums of money, but they were quite strategic interventions. However, we all know the story of what happened to the Pastrana peace process. It collapsed in early 2002, largely due to FARC intransigence and massive abuses of the demilitarized zone in the south of the country. Now, with the election of Juan Manuel Santos as president in 2010, he was an Anglophile with very strong personal ties to the UK. He lived in the UK for a number of years. The British government identified opportunities to, again, broaden relations with Colombia. Santos certainly saw the UK as a partner of choice on a range of issues, including climate, education, trade, and security. In early 2011, he told then Prime Minister Tony Blair that he planned to open peace talks with the FARC and asked whether the UK had any lessons to share from Northern Ireland again. And the Prime Minister suggested he talk to Jonathan Powell, his former Chief of Staff and Northern Ireland negotiator. An advisory group of international experts was established in that year, late 2011, that included Powell and a former Foreign Office official with extensive Latin America and security experience. The group first met in Bogota in early 2012 to discuss strategy with Santos and tactics with his negotiating team before their first encounter with the FARC in Havana, Cuba. The group subsequently met 5 or 6 times a year in Colombia during the 4 years of the negotiations with the FARC. Powell worked closely with Santos as National Security Advisor and Peace Commissioner on lessons from the Northern Ireland peace process. They also undertook a detailed analysis of what had gone wrong during the Pastrana talks with the FARC to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past. Things like having a massive 100-point agenda, and they never got around to talking really substantively about anything. So there was a big lessons learned process. Foreign Office gave full backing to Powell's work, which Santos later described publicly and in London as sort of instrumental and fundamental in many of the decisions that he took during the talks with the FARC. The UK also supported the peace process through diplomatic, programmatic and security channels. At the request of President Santos, we helped guide Colombia through the UN Security Council, leading negotiations to draft Resolution 2261 in January 2016, which established a mission to monitor the peace process. And we also helped Santos arbitrate between different actors in the Colombian system over, for example, disarmament, demobilization and reintegration, and made sure that their negotiators had access to best practice on gender issues. So the UK has been a leading advocate of Colombia's peace process, and supporting the implementation of the 2016 accords with the FARC remains a top priority. To date, the government, or the British government, has spent over £77 million through an integrated security fund to support implementation of the peace agreement in Colombia. And British funding is supporting the Colombian government's rural development and reintegration programs, transitional justice mechanisms, and strengthening the security and participation of communities in conflict areas. As I said before, the UK also holds the Colombia file at the UN Security Council to ensure implementation of the peace agreement. And Colombia is one of the few issues where the P5, the Permanent Five, actually can agree on those things, not agreeing on much else at the moment. It's also worth flagging that since 2011, the UK has committed around £240 million of international climate finance to a large portfolio of projects in Colombia. And British programming there is helping to protect one of the world's most biodiverse countries, countering deforestation, tackling environmental crime and associated violence, as well as developing sustainable and inclusive economies in conflict areas. President Petro's Total Peace Initiative, it's hugely ambitious and hugely complex, as we've already heard, and we'll no doubt talk more about that. Parallel negotiations with so many armed groups has never been tried before. As one of the largest contributors to the peace process with the FARC, the UK wishes to see improved security and a durable peace in Colombia. And Paz Total certainly has those, or is aimed at achieving those goals. Although there are clearly some risks around negotiating agreements with criminal groups and what that might mean for drug trafficking from Colombia. Nevertheless, the British government stands ready to support Paz Total where it can. In February this year, the Colombians requested UN support for Paz Total, and in response, the UK penned a UN Security Council letter to the UN Secretary General, tasking him to come up with options and recommendations for what the UN role should be within a 60-day period. And there is, I think this has already been talked about here, a sort of an emerging consensus on what an expanded UN role in ceasefire monitoring and verification might look like, with a clear focus, I think, on the more political armed groups such as the ELN and the FARC dissidents, Segunda Marquetalia and Estado Mayor Central. The UK government maintains a close dialogue on total peace with the Colombian government, especially the team in the High Commissioner for Peace's office, civil society organizations, the church, and the UN, encouraging progress on securing ceasefires in order to alleviate the suffering of the civilian population in Colombia. And we are also exploring potential lessons sharing on gender and inclusion to support the ELN negotiations, recognizing the strength of women-led civil society organizations in the 2016 peace accords with the FARC. I'll leave it there. I think I managed to stick.
That's fantastic. Yes, thank you so much, Jeremy. That's brilliant. And I think it's a really useful reminder of the UK's involvement in the peace process. Quite often, anyway, here at Oxford, when I tell people I work from Colombia, there's a sort of look that sort of suggests, well, Colombia is very far away and it's nothing really to do with us. But actually, a lot of our taxpayer money is going to Colombia through the UK government, and a lot of the time and expertise of our foreign affairs work and diplomatic mission over there is going towards working on the peace agreement. So we are involved, which makes us, as I mentioned at the beginning, co-responsible as people working in a British institution, I think as well. So thank you, Jeremy. Very useful to hear your perspective on this. We didn't all entirely stick to time, but there was a lot to get through. And so I think what we'll do now is we'll open to audience questions and comments. Because of the way that the sound is functioning with the live streaming, we do not have microphones, but our Q&A will be with microphones to ensure that people online can hear what you're saying. But as I mentioned before, they won't be seeing you. So please do raise your hands who would like to ask a question or make a comment. I think we'll take a round of maybe 3 or 4, collect a few different ones, and then we'll come back to the panel to get their responses and take it from there. So first one over here, then down here, and then Christoph over there. And if you could introduce yourself, panel, as well, that'd be helpful.
Thank you much. My name is Esteban Maya, and I'm a senior lecturer in Spanish and Latin American Studies. Yeah, so first I just want to say I agree with many of the points, the importance of transdisciplinarity, international community, etc. I have two questions, if possible. Would you want to speak just one?
No, you can ask two, and if you want to address them to specific panelists, do say so. If you want to just leave them open, also we can divide them up. Not everyone will need to respond to everything. Yeah.
Perfect. So actually, my first question is to Andre. To what extent can we actually call these examples that you gave achievements? Because there's certain I can see a couple we can definitely call them achievements. But otherwise they seem like steps, or the president saying something or intending to do something, but he's saying something, can we say that that's actually something that he has achieved? And then this is for the panel in general. I wanted to ask, I guess, the extent to which total peace is possible whilst Venezuela is under the current regime and with the current circumstances. And with the flow of migrants, with both the opportunities and the challenges that they bring. So yeah, I just want you to hear your thoughts about some of them. We already talked about the ELN encountering some spaces in Venezuela, but of course there's a lot more to it. So I just wanted to hear from the panel.
Thank you, Esteban. It's very helpful. Yeah, sure. Let's have Christoph first.
Yeah, hello, I'm Christoph. I'm doing a deep dive in politics here and work from Colombia. My question to the panel overall, I guess, would be if all these negotiations with the different groups work out, what's the expectation? Wouldn't just like new actors follow in the steps of these groups that have been mobilized? So I mean, the incentive structures of those economies, just such as narco trafficking, illegal gold mine, remain in place, right? So what's the risk of that? What kind of actors would come? Could one expect to step in, and what could be potentially a solution to actually create like sustainably demonetization also of potential new actors?
Thanks. Very important question, Christoph.
Hi, my name is Jamie Schmick, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard Kennedy School. There are many people here, so I still hang around. Thank you so much for all of your presentations. It's been really helpful to see the very different approaches that you all have to the questions around global peace. But my question builds a little bit on the point about Venezuela. I've been sitting in a few working groups with the opposition there about the transition in Venezuela. And a big challenge that they see is how enmeshed transnational groups, and specifically the ELN, is in effectively propping up their economy, and that is going to be a big challenge for them as they getting their regime out. So, speaking to the idea of Colombia being in a neighborhood, and a lot of these groups acting transnationally, and then other groups like Mexican cartels being present, how do you see Petros looking at sort of the broader regional implications of total peace, and how what goes on in the region will affect, either help or hurt, his plan for total peace?
Thank you, Jamie. Do we have? Yeah, let's take these two more, and then three more, and then we'll come back to the panel. Well, I think it's we get a few, and then because you guys have talked a lot, so give them a chance. And you can divide these questions up.
I'm Juan Pablo Orjuela. I am a senior researcher at the School of Geography and the Environment. And well, I just wanted to give the panel the opportunity to expand on their thoughts of the changes in the cabinet that you all mentioned. And I struggle to read this as a process of moving away from this traditional elites of control of politics in Colombia, or as a way of diminishing the power of the democratic discourse that has been happening. And these two readings are quite opposite in my mind, and it's not very clear to see is Petro taking an approach of giving up on this national pact, or is Petro taking more like a step towards moving away from the traditional elite? And your comments on that?
Yeah, thank you, Juan Pablo.
Hi, my name is Lisa. I'm a Colombian student here at the university. My question is for Andre, but in general, if any of you want to address it. It's about the role of civil society organizations under Petro. I think that the most progressive organizations are kind of facing an identity crisis, I think. While having like a friend in government, which is, I mean, this is just a funny anecdote, but it illustrates the point. Like in the process that Petro summons, like they don't even know what to chant, because they only know like chanting is the government, and now they don't know, like what do we go Petro. So yeah, I think they're facing an identity crisis, and one would expect that they would be like that energy that they brought from the peace process would be lost just by having a friend in government. So like my question is like, what do you see the role of civil society organizations for the next 3 years?
Thank you, Luisa. It's a fantastic question. Makes me think of all of the people who were at the beginning when Petro won saying, "We are now the government." And I was left thinking, how long is that feeling going to last? So a final question, Jorge, down here with Luis, down here, and then we'll come back to the panel. And if you've got more questions, we'll have you in the next round.
This is Canadian Colombia. I was really interested in everything that's been said on the panel, and really agree with most of what was said too. But there is one aspect that maybe we should also take into consideration, and that's economic resources, because the peace process itself, even if Petro becomes all the political difficulties, is actually going to require considerable amount of funds. And Colombia's experiencing inflation, etc., and also the international cooperation that was given for the peace process under Ivan Duque was spent on peace with legality, and very little on actually the implementation of the 2016 Accord. So the coffers are empty really at the moment. And then if we take into account the geopolitical situation with Sudan and Ukraine, etc., we're not seeing very much money going into Colombia in terms of international cooperation. And then we have to take into account the amount of companies, extractive companies in particular, but others, that are suing Colombia in international tribunals, which could amount to millions and millions of dollars in compensation to these companies. And I'm just interested to have comments from the panel on what their thoughts are on these kinds of issues, because without funding, this is not going to work. I mean, as it is, even though Petro is committed to buying land from the FARC, I've forgotten what it's called now, so the Ranchers Association, he doesn't have sufficient funds to buy what they're setting out to buy in the first place. So it'd be really interesting just from the economic aspect as well.
Brilliant, thank you, Louise. Well, we've got a bunch of questions on the table. Some of them are directed to some of you specifically. Others, I think, would be really interesting to hear Ivan specifically talking about Venezuela, for example, maybe Jeremy to talk a little bit about how Colombia is seen as not a priority among international organizations and how that might affect funding, but you might also all wish to address different questions. So perhaps we'll go in the same order and start with Jenny. And if you could try and pick the ones that you are most interested in, you don't have to deal with all of them, and try to keep it to 5 minutes each so we can then have another round of questions.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think this issue of the cabinet is very important, and what is actually going on there. And because, of course, lots of people are accusing Petro of ultimately going to a concentration of power. He started off, I think it's very important to recognize, in fact, there were people connecting his government and the coalition he was building to the idea of a new Frente Nacional, which was the pact of the 50s and onwards. And I think he was at that trying, because he didn't have a majority in Congress, to build something which will bring different elites together. And he's been at that for several months. And of course, it's reached a point where to get his, particularly the reforms now, the pension reform, the labour reform, the agrarian reform, to get those through is going to be extremely difficult. And I think, and the health reform, which is obviously key. And I suspect that one of the issues that particularly drove him to get rid of his past cabinet was because the health reform just got through the 7th Commission in Congress, because the guerrilla, the Liberal Party, had actually said his party should not vote for the health reform, and some of the Liberal Party actually said they would not accept guerrilla's position on this. So it's a very complicated, detailed answer, and I'll try to be very quick. But basically, it's very interesting that he came out on May the 1st very much against guerrilla's control of the Liberal Party. So I potentially think he's felt there is a moment where he might divide that party. And also his messages are to sort of go back to that radical liberal element that's in the history of Colombia, with Pumarejo, the first agrarian reform, with Gaitan, who was assassinated in Bogota. So I suspect that there's a sort of move there to see whether he can actually divide the elite and try and then get something through of his reforms by doing that. More than that, though, I think he also realized that there were very complex and conflicting messages coming out of his cabinet and his government. That was being used a lot by the media to show and suggest there was chaos. There were specific issues of confidence. He's already explained that with his economy minister, the fight with Ocampo. And I think that in the end, he decided he had to act on that. And if you look at the cabinet he's now got, it is much more people very close to him from way back, including the finance minister, Burnyeat, who comes from his group for a long time. And so I think he's decided he needs people around him who agree with him, rather than go for that big sort of more looking for a broader acuerdo, national front or something like that. But who knows whether that will succeed. It's very complicated with the nature of the political system, the relationship with the president to the legislature, etc., etc. So we will see. The other question I just wanted to respond to as well is, I think this is a very important one about, well, okay, what happens if he does manage to do the deals with the actors in terms of who will fill the vacuum? And I think that's in the air all the time, right? I've just been in Urubá, and I've just, which for many, the Clan del Golfo is co-governing. We've already heard the role of the clan with the migrants crossing the Darien Gap, right? But also their role in the mining. It's not just drugs anymore. No. And so it's incredibly important to recognize the sort of the risks. I want to just put something on the table because I just got some information yesterday, which is actually is quite interesting. If you look at the levels of conflict, armed conflict and homicides through armed conflict, they have, with respect to the Clan del Golfo and with respect to the Estado Mayor Central of the FARC, the ex-FARC, they have actually reduced, right? There has been in that ceasefire, which is complicated as we know, there actually has been a reduction in the use of homicides. So I think, and confrontations, something is going on. So one could at least say, I mean, because this is so complex, that actually at least if there was some willingness to look at the use of violence in all of this, that would be a step. It clearly doesn't tick all the boxes, as we know, because if the illegal economy continues, so there's a big issue about, well, what deals would you do? How much wealth would you, from illegal accumulation, would you retain in any deal that was done through sometimiento to justice? So there are clearly, I mean, but I think, if you look at the complexity and you face it, and then you say, well, at least there are these steps going on. I mean, I agree, how much are the steps actually showing success? I think that was a good question. But I think it's outside the box, isn't it? Totally. It's trying to say, well, we have to do something. What else is there? What else is there? At least you begin this process of negotiation, and that's where I would just finish here, to link that negotiation with these different groups to an economic change.
Sure.
And I think you cannot see the two from isolation from each other. Petro is well aware the vacuum will be filled if he doesn't find a way in which the economy is going to offer decent jobs. The labour reform, you actually look at what the labour reform is, you know, it's only reducing a 48-hour week to a 42-hour week. You know, they still work incredible hours in Colombia, formally, right? So it's not like absolutely revolutionary, right? But he's trying to say, let's look again at the way our economy works. Let's try and think how you could rethink the commodity sector, and with respect to climate change, let's think about new possibilities of employment. And so for me, that aspects of the change, which is really also very difficult, you have to see it alongside the total peace if we're going to avoid the filling of the vacuum when if any negotiation is successful.
Thank you, Jenny. That's fantastic. Ivan.
Thank you. Well, I'll jump into the question of Venezuela. Came out a few times, and that's something which we work a lot on in Crisis Group. We're very close to. So, and particularly the Colombian-Venezuelan relationship. I mean, as everyone should know here, until last year, until Petro came to power, there was a total diplomatic rupture between Venezuela and Colombia. There was a lot of insecurity at the border. Armed groups were crossing over informal paths, trochas, as they're called. They were controlling these informal paths. Migrants were leaving Venezuela and paying commissions to these armed groups, and it was effectively a no man's land, controlled by non-state actors. And Petro obviously acted, I think, totally correctly in saying that for simple humanitarian security reasons, we can't have a diplomatic breakup and a total rupture between two countries which share a border of 2,200 kilometers. It's absolutely impossible. And so he made a great effort from the very first to restore relations with Nicolas Maduro's government in Caracas, which is not easy. Maduro is a tricky political customer, and that's putting it mildly. And obviously Petro had to flatter him. He had to send an ambassador who was effectively adulating the Maduro and the head of the military and other figures in Chavismo, and this helped move things along. And Petro has since been seen quite a number of times with Maduro. But what's its mission been? Well, I think it's to bring Venezuela back in, establish relations, get Venezuela involved in the ELN peace process. Venezuela is a guarantor to that process. The ELN is now a binational guerrilla. It has a very significant presence in Venezuela. It works alongside Venezuelan local authorities and security forces. Now, you might think this is an appalling thing of sort of a terrorist cooperation with the state. It's more complicated than that, because that cooperation really stepped up at the moment that Colombia and Venezuela broke their ties. There was a degree of Colombian aggression towards Venezuela, and the Venezuelan armed forces looked to the ELN as a sort of strategic front line, proxy front line, to control communities along the border area. And that's a process which we saw very, very clearly in 2019. So yes, the ELN was also involved in exploiting illegal mines in the south of Venezuela and working with the military there. But there was also a sort of strategic political side to that mission. And I think if you speak to senior Chavistas, they are absolutely honest about the role the ELN has played. So it was very important for ELN peace talks, for border security, for renewing trade, for having a conversation about the 2.5 million Venezuelan migrants in Colombia to restore those relations. But Petro wanted something more. And this is where it gets complicated. He obviously understood that unless Venezuela reaches some form of peace settlement between the government and opposition, there are going to be waves of problems in the future, because maybe one day it won't be Biden in the White House, it could be Trump again, or DeSantis. They could have a much more draconian policy towards Venezuela. Colombia would then be on the front line itself and have to take a very difficult decision as to what to do, because Colombia's main historical ally is the United States. And so its relationship with Venezuela could put it in a difficult position. So Petro understood all of this, and he's made a gambit to promote from the region peace in Venezuela. Now, he had a major conference in Bogota last week, which was fascinating to watch how that happened, described by one person as jazz diplomacy. You just say, let's have a conference, let's just throw out invitations to many different people and see what happens. And it actually was a very interesting event, brought in people from a very high level delegation from the United States, Joseph Borrell, head of the EU's foreign policy, delegations from very senior expert on Venezuela from Norway, but it didn't produce the goods. And I'm not going to go into the reasons here, largely because they're extremely confidential, but but it failed to really move things along, and it will be difficult because between the US government and Maduro, there is not a lot of trust, and neither is willing to take the first step forward to get the confidence building process going, and neither trusts a word the others say, whether it's US lifting sanctions, whether it's the Venezuelan government creating conditions for decent elections next year. So the risk, I think, is that Petro is in the middle now. He's in the middle between his historical ally and his new best friend. And this means that, anything which could happen, a massive increase in migration from Venezuela. Venezuelan economy is still rock bottom, and the migrants are coming across. Anti-democratic moves by Maduro, not improbable. Increase in US-Venezuelan tensions, anything which could happen on the border. Petro could find himself compromised. He could be accused of being a friend of a sort of renewed authoritarian drift in Venezuela next year, and that would compromise him domestically with his own conservative constituencies who are very pro-Republican democratic in Republican, the sense of Republican values in Colombia. So I think it's a very tricky one. Does Venezuela want to sabotage, however, peace in Colombia? I would not go that far. That's where I wouldn't go. I think Venezuela will defend its perceived interest, but I'm not sure that Venezuela is going to wake up one day, or Maduro is going to think, right, this ELN peace talk, I'm not interested in it. We're going to bring it down. I just want to say one more thing, and the reason for that is that Maduro's also got to look at the ELN presence in his country. That could be there for a very long period of time. And although it's something which Chavistas don't want to talk about, they are going to have to think about a peace process for those combatants on their soil. And it's not an easy matter at all. And there are voices within Chavismo that also want to crack down on the ELN on their territory. So it's quite complicated.
Fantastic. No, that's brilliant. Thank you. I love jazz diplomacy. It just made me start thinking maybe this is a jazz peace process.
That's right. It's yeah, I think you're on something.
Andre, I know you're going to be tempted to answer all of the questions, but please focus on the ones that you've been specifically asked first, and then if you've got time at the end, you can deal with the politics. But you've got two on the table for yourself there.
No, let me start with Stefan's question. That is a very good question. I think the first thing that I would say is, yeah, there are steps that you can see them as steps, some of them, and achievements, others. And the important thing is to look this against the background of the previous administration and to remember where Colombia was in August 2022. According to the International Committee of the Red Cross, we have 5 armed conflicts ongoing in the country. The war was intensifying, homicides were growing, and to have a president that has managed to somehow, as Jenny was saying, has managed to talk to the different illegal armed groups, both high impact and some of them political actors who have been opposing the state, or others who have been benefiting from criminal economies, and say, why don't we do a reduction of violence? And why don't we start thinking that there is a possibility of a negotiated solution and a way that is not a militarized way? Is an incredible thing to do. In terms of the ELN, I mean, I was just telling you, it took Santos 4 years to start a formal negotiation process with the ELN. And after what Duque had done during 4 years of his presidency, destroying the whole trust upon the international community, because he was asking the international community to violate the protocols that the ELN and the government had agreed for bringing, if the negotiations broke down. So being able to rebuild the trust with the ELN so quickly to try to start negotiations and to take the negotiation agenda agreed with Santos and say this is going to be the core of our negotiation agenda. So I'm not starting from zero, but I'm going to actually use the Santos agreement that you did in 2017, and we are just going to polish it a bit, and we're going to start moving in that direction. I think it's a tremendous achievement. And again, to tell the Clan del Golfo, hey, what about if you stop just thinking of yourselves as criminal actors and start thinking yourselves as political actors? I mean, I think that's the opposite of what has happened in Colombia in the 1990s. That was the criminalization of politics. Well, here is the politicization of criminals, which is good because we need politics in order to resolve our problems. And when you are actually telling people there is a way out, that is not just by killing you and eliminating you, and the people start believing that that's a possibility, well, you are opening a completely new, different ballgame here. So I think those are the achievements that I would like to highlight. And the other thing is thinking about Bajo Cauca, where, you know, the Clan del Golfo agreed, or the paramilitary groups agreed on this bilateral ceasefire that many people criticized because it was not on 100%. When the government of Petro decided to stop the bilateral ceasefire, I was talking to many of the social leaders in Bajo Cauca, them on the ground. But they were telling us, we don't want the bilateral ceasefire agreement to come to an end because this has improved our security situation on the ground. It's not perfect, but it's 100% better. So no, we are demanding Petro to go back to the bilateral ceasefire. So I think those are important achievements that we need to recognize, because there has been a reduction of 7.5% in the homicides rate in Colombia in the first quarter of this year. And in terms, when we think, for example, in the terms of former combatants of the FARC, if we compare the first 3 months of 2023 with the first 3 months of 2022, we have that last year, 12 former combatants of the FARC were killed, when the first 3 months of 2023, only 4 of them were killed. Of course, violence is still there, but there is a reduction of violence, and I think that these are important achievements. Now go to the question of Luisa. What is the role of civil society? Well, civil society is a very complex group of diverse organizations. You have right-wing groups there, you have left-wing groups there, you have centrist groups there. I think the groups who have been working for peace for many years, campaigning for peace, I think, you know, let's think about in the past. That is one of the organizations that does monitoring. What they have been doing is to continue doing what they were doing before. Every single time a former combatant is killed, they have a poster on Twitter. They are monitoring the situation of the killing of social leaders, the killing of former combatants of the FARC, the number of massacres taking place in Colombia, and they are constantly saying, we believe in Petro's total peace policy, but we can see that it's not easy to achieve. And we are calling on illegal armed groups and on the state to respect the life of Colombians, to reduce the levels of violence. So I think that in this moment, these organizations need to continue doing what they were doing before. They need to continue campaigning for nonviolence. That's what they need to be doing. And they need to continue pushing the Petro administration to avoid following a war logic to try to defeat the Clan del Golfo and the other criminal groups. I think the focus on the illegal economies, not on the individuals, but the focus on the infrastructures that allow the reproduction of violence is a very good approach, and civil society has been campaigning for that. The big challenge is for another sector of civil society, and is that indifferent sector of civil society that never participates, that does not believe in peace building, that actually thinks that Colombia is doomed to be in war forever. How do you achieve what Maria Jose Pizarro said yesterday in the inauguration of the negotiations with the third round of negotiations with the ELN and Pablo Beltran, how do you achieve the idea that in this negotiation, those who never participate in politics should be involved in the decision-making of bringing about peace in Colombia? Which brings me to the last point that I want to make to wrap up this comment, and is how do you achieve what the aim of this total peace policy that Petro has, that is a national pact? How do you actually make sure that you can bring all the spectrum of the political, economic, and social actors to agree that the way forward for Colombia is a non-violent way, that violence hasn't solved the problem in the past, and that there is a need to stop violence and to transform the economic, political, and social structures of the country? And how to involve those who do not want to participate? That's the big challenge.
Thank you, Andre. Jeremy.
Yeah, I mean, Louise, I think your point is obviously relevant, because there are so many other issues going on the international agenda. I mean, I can only speak as an analyst looking at British policy. What does surprise me, though, and is really good, is the level of commitment there still is to supporting the peace process in Colombia. I think that's been consistent. And we see that at the UN as well. So I think the political and diplomatic support will be there. And I can see, the UN Security Council continuing to support that process and to want to lean in and be as helpful as possible. Now, whether that translates subsequently into big money to support programs, I think is more complicated. I mean, the fiscal reform that took place in Colombia is, I think, given, as I understand it, I'm not a techie economist, but it's given a little bit of wriggle room as well. I mean, there is certainly money around in Colombia that could be diverted into some of the priorities, and I certainly think that's what Petro wants to do. But yeah, I mean, I think there is that commitment to Colombia, and it will be there, but it may not be, translate into the big money that I think you're talking about, which is what you see to underpin some of the huge structural reforms that we've been talking about for 20 or 30 years in Colombia. Some progress in some areas, less progress in others. And I see internationally, I mean, I can't speak for US policy or EU or Spanish policy, but I think the US has been engaging well with Petro. I mean, I think his visit to the US went extremely well. The music around that was very positive. Now, whether again that translates into something in terms of big money, I mean, that's another issue. So those are ongoing challenges. But I certainly, from inside, looking at it from inside the FCDO, I think Latin America generally, I mean, I can speak openly as an analyst, always struggles to get the attention. I spent 32 years trying to put Latin America up the agenda. But within that, I think Colombia remains a key priority. No question about that, because of the level of commitment that we've given. And it's all relative, because there are other bigger players, obviously, in Colombia, the US and others. But I think there is that commitment. And you see that at the senior level, willing to, ministers willing to engage with their Colombian counterparts and doing so on a regular basis. I've been surprised at the level of high-level engagement that we've seen in the last 18 months or 2 years. So straddling Duque into Petro. And I think that's a real plus. And there are some others in the office who moan that Colombia gets too much attention. But it's all relative, obviously, because we are, others in the room may have you. We've been an important niche player in Colombia, but we are niche. We have to be honest. There are others coming at it with much bigger numbers.
Fantastic, thank you. With the mood music, it just makes me feel like this is a whole kind of musical
that
analogy.
wasn't deliberate picking up.
No, it's good. It's good.
Yeah. Can I just add one point on Venezuela?
Please,
I think Venezuela is critical to the whole process with the ELN for all the reasons that particularly Ivan has said and others around the table. It is enormously complex. We shouldn't forget, I suppose, that Chavez played an important role in getting the FARC to the table.
Yeah.
I suppose, again, from an analytical point of view, I think we need to be a bit cautious about overestimating the influence that, given the way things have evolved with the ELN presence in Venezuela, not to overestimate the potential influence that Maduro and some in the regime have over the ELN, because it tends to be the more radical factions that sit in Venezuela and have been there for a long period of time, who are less convinced that negotiations is the way forward, and are much more heavily engaged in illicit activities than some more political factions within the ELN. So I think that's going to be very complicated.
Thank you.
But
Jeremy.
Petro's right to engage. I mean, it's five meetings, I think he's had now. Yes.
I think we've got time for maybe 2-3 more.
Oh.
Okay, we'll have those 4 questions, and then we'll give panelists maybe 2 minutes each to wrap up.
2 minutes.
Yeah.
How generous.
Well, we can go and sing your responses. Done.
I accompanied my mother on the 3 visits to the Pastrana peace process.
Yeah.
And I was ambassador in Colombia in 2008, 2012, a long time ago. That's 2 questions. One, Jeremy, you explained all this British support for peace in Colombia. What have we got in return? Has it just been purely altruistic, or have we been let down? One of the consequences of the Santos deal in 2016 was a massive increase in cocoa production and cocoa came into the country, county lines, knife crime, and so on. Does anybody draw a connection, or do we just regard it as collateral damage? And the other question was, more for the others, how far did majority opinion in Colombia regard the issue of peace as being of any great interest? I mean, it's a great interest in us, obviously, a great interest in this kind of gathering. But how far does the Joe public in Colombia regard what Petro is doing, which I think is terrific, because it's looking up the agenda and addressing all connected issues, which I think first time is highly sort of commendable. How far is the ordinary Colombian public behind it? Because getting things to change will require some kind of consensus that I'm not sure is yet there.
Thank you, John.
Thank you. Diana Rose, also a former ambassador to Cuba and on the board of ODI, the Global Issues think tank. 2 quick questions, if I may. One is, to what extent do you see a risk of a lack of democratic space at the community level, comunidades de base, from the former armed actors getting too much control? I'm thinking of what I've heard from Medellin. And then the other question is, we've heard about what was the learning from Northern Ireland and what relevance that had to Colombia. What learning do you see out of Colombia that might be relevant to some of the conflicts today, like in Sudan? To what extent is that exchange? And I'm thinking now that the Foreign Office has increased the Monroe Doctrine, stuck in its pivot to Asia. It's put Latin America and Africa under one minister. To what extent is the same exchange there about learning from Colombia relevant to countries in sub-Saharan Africa?
Thank you, Diana. And just on this point about learning lessons from Colombia for other countries, I think one of the things that Colombia could really offer the world, especially at a time in which the Ukraine and Russia crisis is so important, is what is the role of disinformation in peace processes, which is a big challenge that the Santos peace process had to deal with, and which of course everyone is talking about in the Ukraine and Russia conflict as well. Who was the other? Nadia.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Sandra. Thank you very much for this very informative discussion. I Colombia, and I like this in the media, and I get very conflicted with the different views. And I think it's a feeling that a lot of Colombians we are sharing. Something I want to ask is the role of the people in the streets, the population, and when we have Petro gone in the balcony and say that people really should get to the streets and start a revolution is something that I see with some nervosism. I feel nervous about it. And also I feel nervous when he says, if my laws don't pass in the Congress, people should get out. And again, I think it's something that in the media and something that a lot of people are feeling very nervous about. And the second question will be, what is the role of the police and the army forces in all these conflicts? What I can perceive is that the armed forces are demoralized, they feel debilitated. There are a lot of people are leaving the forces. So what's happening and what's the role of the armed forces when we talk about total peace, but they are outside the discussion? So I think it's something.
Thank you, Sandra. We would clearly have enough for a whole other round, but well, we'll get all the tech questions on the table and you guys can see what you can do. Nadia, hi.
Okay, thanks. I'm Nadia Santo Domingo. I'm lecturer here in political sciences, but then I'm a Colombian and so interested in all these topics. Right. So my question is more on the fair play. So Andre mentioned that there were these issues with one of the challenges that we are facing is that the government somehow betrayed the British government betrayed the peace agreement and the accord by kind of entramping some of the main actors. So how can we secure them, like what lessons are we learning from that? And how can we secure it? How can we from this movement like Rodríguez and Diálogo, that this won't happen again? So that is one question. And then another very quick one is like just coming around, probably the first question is like what the UK gets in return from supporting this, but then what is then the UK doing to prevent and to promote like the fundamental problems of the Colombian challenges that we have in terms of like illegal mining and in terms of the drugs policy, and yeah, but what is this other spectrum? Not what you are getting, but also what you are doing to support these other things, because giving money and providing some kind of like analysis and all that is important, but it's like, from my point of view, it's like giving insulin to the person with diabetes, but not really attacking the fundamental problem of sugar. So I would like to know, like, what is your opinion about that?
Thank you, Nadia, and fantastic to end with that medical scientific metaphor there. So I'm going to be really mean and give you each 1 minute. You don't have to address it all. We can continue in the wine. A lot of these questions are big questions, so you can just sketch some bits and pieces. And we'll start backwards this time. So Jeremy, is the UK doing enough?
Well, I mean, we can, people always want us to do more, but I think what I've tried to set out and what I see as an analyst is that by our UK Latin America relationship, we've been doing a substantial amount in Colombia. Sometimes probably not good at expressing and at setting out what we have been doing. I mean, the climate fund money is very significant over a period of time, 240 million since 2015. That's a significant chunk of money. I mean, John, your point, what do we get in return? Well, I mean, I shouldn't be telling an ex-ambassador how to suck eggs and so on, but it's not always a transactional thing, which is we'll give you a certain amount of money if we see a 5% reduction in cocaine coming out of Colombia. And the cocaine thing is far more complex than that. And I think it's about a long-term commitment. And I tried to set the UK-Colombia relationship in a little bit of historical context, that within our small world of UK Latin America relations, actually Colombia does figure as a sort of special relationship. And so there is a commitment. This is a strategic country in the heart of South America. And we're trying in our small way to contribute tackling some of the root drivers, root causes of conflict, and supporting a peace process, no matter how imperfect. You know, some would argue that the 2016 agreement is, you know, it hasn't been fully implemented, but the glass is more than half full rather than half empty. That's certainly the way I see it. And where would Colombia be now without that process? And so, you know, supporting that long-term commitment, I think does make sense. And yes, people do get distracted by the figures, the annual, of course, which are controversial themselves in terms of how you measure coca leaf production, cocaine production. But I think there is the sense of a long-term commitment. I suppose, again, from an analytical point of view, I could see always there's an argument that the international community needs to be more joined up, perhaps in Colombia as it needs to be in other places as well, to have even bigger impact. But yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Jeremy. And I think it would be really interesting for the conversation over drinks to ask also what other things the UK might be getting out of its investment in Colombia in terms of international investment. I remember when Santos came for his state visit, there was a whole team of people, I think, looking at, you know, scientific investigation in Colombia, pharmaceuticals, mining. I mean, there's a lot of education. There's a whole kind of enmeshment that goes far beyond the peace policy as well. But we don't have time for that now. Andre.
I'm not gonna name the people I'm responding to, but let me make the following points. First, public opinion is changing in Colombia. Petro has tried to really bring the whole Colombian society to talk about politics. And I think that's a great success. But his level of popularity, he who represents the face of peace, the total peace, are falling. So he went from 70% to 60% to 50% to 40%. This thanks to the role of the media that Jenny was talking about to a great extent. But also, I mean, in particular. Second, the Office of the High Commissioner for Peace has been making very clear that in the regions where they are engaging with illegal armed groups, the first things that they do is to engage with community grassroots organizations, to listen to them, and they are making sure that they are a key fundamental actor in the negotiations, not only with the ELN, but with the Estado Mayor Central of the previous FARC. The 7,000 campesinos participating a week before the monitoring mechanism was created. Third, a lesson learned from Colombia for the other peace processes is that peace building is not a technical exercise. Peace building is political. And if you don't play the political game, you might suffer what happened to the Santos administration and all the investments and the strength that the UK did. The fourth point that I want to do is you shouldn't be afraid of the revolution that Petro is calling on the streets. Actually, precisely because peace is political, what Petro is trying to do is trying to put on the agenda a radical democracy in Colombia, which deserves the participation of people in the streets on engaging on the important issues that are important for the country, and they shouldn't just be trapped in Congress. The fifth point that I want to make is that the police and the military, both of them, are participating in peace negotiations. They are part of the negotiation team with the ELN in particular, but also they are helping with all the logistical operations that are taking place in setting up the negotiations with the dissidents of the FARC. So they are pretty much behind this. And the final point that I want to make is, how can we avoid to make this that happened to the FARC again? Well, we need all transformation in the political culture in Colombia, because this is not only the responsibility of civil society, but we need to change the cultural mindset of the prosecutor of Colombia. This is the reason why, and I'm sorry to repeat this again, the most important thing for the country is to try to get to the point in the next 2 or 3 years to build a national political pact that sort of protects the idea of peace in Colombia and non-violence as the way to solve our problems.
Thanks, Andre. Ivan.
Thank you. I'm going to refer to your two questions to start with, because I think that's crucial. I mean, I share a degree of unease after what happened last week, but above all, because of one part of that ministerial reshuffle. The Economist, the Minister of Finance, really the most respected economist in the whole of Latin America, who is himself a progressive, who piloted what can, yes, be regarded as the one undoubted achievement of Petro's government so far, which was a tax reform at the end of last year, left office, Jose Antonio Ocampo. I get worried if you are trying to change everything that you don't have a stable economic anchor because of what happens elsewhere in Latin America. If you take your foot off the pedal of the economic stability, as I've seen up close and personal in Argentina, in Venezuela, you get trouble. And Petro does talk about emitting state bonds to give to the victims and other such things, which is just playing straight into inflation at a moment when inflation is running at 13, 14%, whereas growth is at 1%. These are concerns. Not that Burnyeat is not a respected economist. The question is, can Burnyeat say no to Petro? Petro does not. Petro's an amazing speaker, has many talents, but he's not famed for being the best listener in the world. And that could be so it's an issue. But at the same time, you've got to break some of the controlling powers which are impeding Petro. When he gave that very furious speech in Zarzal last week, what was the issue at the core of it? He said, I had struck a deal to buy 3 million hectares of land from the Cattle Ranchers Association, Fedegan, and the offer they made me was 200,000 hectares all the way close to the Venezuelan border on unfertile land, which we can't do anything with, because that was what they wanted to give me. They weren't giving me any of the really valuable land that they are totally misusing in other parts of the country. So he's frustrated when that happens. He's frustrated when political parties don't listen. But at the same time, yes, it's concerning to see what might happen if he turns to the street and also turns to one-by-one negotiation with congressional deputies, which is a little bit on the plan at the moment. He's still going to negotiate with Congress, but on a one-by-one level, what that might involve. Last of all, the role of the police and the army. A lot of they were unsettled. The senior members of the armed forces, I think, at the beginning of the Petro government, to a degree, they've stabilized a little bit. They've established a sort of a working understanding. Maybe the communication is not great. The armed forces, no doubt, standing off. They're not going into operations if they can avoid it because of the risk. They feel that they don't have any legal coverage and support from the government if something goes wrong. So there is uncertainty. At the same time, since the bilateral ceasefire with the Gulf clan ended, there have been more operations. So there's still a certain margin of maneuver. And I think if you look at the security plan itself, it's fairly supportive of most of the official goals of the armed forces. And it doesn't even say an end to forced eradication. It said strategically, if required, forced eradication will continue. So there is some tolerance, but it's a very difficult relationship. That said, the armed forces respect their constitutional role and they would not rise up against the political establishment. So I think we can discount that.
Thank you, Ivan. Jenny.
I think this issue of what is an economy for peace is very important. And on the one hand, there is this question mark when Petro came out about the complaining that Banco de la República would not give bonds to enable them to finance the peace. I did sort of reflect on when it was that the economic elites were prepared to pay a war tax under Uribe, and why can't we have a peace tax in Colombia? And maybe there is some way in which one could refound this debate. So it's not about the stability of the economy, but it's actually about recognizing that if there is not a sort of commitment to an economy that supports the peace, we won't get the peace, quite frankly. And that worries me, obviously. But I also think this issue, do people want peace, that John Dew raised is very significant. And I think obviously one looks back to the referendum after the plebiscite, after the 2016 peace accord, and you think, well, they rejected it. They rejected it for reasons I think we know, and I know Andre wrote a very good book on it. But I think actually, when we look at what happened after the 2016 accord, what it did was to get people to look again at the wider problems of the society. And I don't think you could understand the protests of 2022 if you didn't understand that actually there were other issues apart from the war and the violences that are taking place, which are obviously absolutely vital, but they connect also to how young people, get access to education, and how, what the tax system does and who pays the tax. So, I think what Petro is doing is putting the broader issues of who is this country for? What is the economy for? How can it be that Colombia is one of the most unequal in the world? Its Gini coefficient for that is the most unequal in the world. That we will not solve the problems of the country unless these things are dealt with. So for me, he is putting that out there in the discussion in a clear way for everybody, but I don't think anyone will deny the great complexity. I don't want to leave the elites out of this. I think they have responsibility to start playing a role and rethinking their own commitments to peace and non-violence, and the fact that the economy that they are prepared to, or the changes in the economy they're prepared to accept, is going to be very significant as to whether that will happen. But I also wanted to say this issue about, well, what will happen to democracy on the street, democracy in the comunas of Medellin and other places, because I agree with Andre that there's been attempts which didn't happen, I think, enough with 2016, a pedagogy of the peace process. There has been some attempt under Petro to do sort of processes of getting people to be involved in that. But actually, when I've just been in the streets of Medellin, people don't feel that's reaching them. And I do think that's going to be a critical issue. How is it? Because Colombia does have an extraordinary history on the ground, as well as the history of violence, as I said before, of people building peace. Comuna 13 in Medellin, which is a place that's known for some of the greatest violences, and the Operación Orión of Uribe, etc., etc. But I was in Comuna 13 in the 1980s, when they were actually developing development plans for their comuna. They called themselves Realizadores de los Sueños. I've got the book on my bookshelf, and I continuously look at it when people think, well, it's all violence. There's a lot of capacity in Colombia to think outside the box, to sort of, in that sense, what the issue of the threat that calling people to mobilize is, obviously one worries because there's a lot of violence out there, but I actually think those 2022 protests were not violent. Sorry, 21, yes. Sorry, were not violent, generally. There were fringe elements that clearly there was rats and ransacking, and we know that went on. There was violence from the police. But generally speaking, in the history of Colombia, they were pretty exceptional protests. And it feels to me that if you read what Petro talks about, and I've read his autobiography, I think he is dedicated to non-violence. He's also claims to be part of the 1990, well, there are people who have questioned how role he played in the 1991 constitution, but I think he did play a very important role. I think he does not want to overthrow that constitution. And that means that I think it is important to have people coming onto the street in favor of this in a non-violent way, if that can be managed.
Thank you, Jenny, and thank you all for your patience. I know we've gone slightly over time, but I think it's been absolutely worth it. I just want to end with a couple of closing reflections. It's been a great privilege and honor to co-host together with Winchester, Rodemos Diálogo, and the Colombian Society here at Oxford, what I think is the first conversation in the UK taking stock from so many different perspectives on total peace. I know that AB Colombia did an event recently, or is about to do one, but I think here we've got a multiplicity of points of view, and I think it's about time that we had these kinds of conversations here in the UK. So it's been wonderful to have you all here today to do so. I think we've heard really important things about total peace, not just as a policy, but as a vision, as Jenny said, and as Andre called it, perhaps a paradigm shift in peace building, perhaps also a paradigm shift in state building, at least if you want to look at it in that way, which of course involves a very ambitious plan of parallel negotiations, which, as Jeremy mentioned, hasn't been tried before to such a degree. And we've heard a bit from all of our speakers today about the complexity of the problem of all of the different armed groups, their different nature, the armed groups, the criminal groups, the complexity of the problem, just simply to end violence without talking about making that sustainable and building peace, which is another great big issue. And of course, Jenny made the important point that all of that negotiation strategy and ending the violence and security strategy has to be understood through Petro's lenses of seeing that in conjunction with the broader structural reforms, which, as Christoph, quite rightly pointed out in his question, if you don't take away the incentive for violence and criminality, then new armed groups will always emerge. And so a lot is at stake when we're talking about these reforms going through Congress, such as tax and health, which, are controversial, but they are connected to the broader picture. We've also heard a lot about all of the many moving political parts involved in this issue. And as Andre emphasized, got there before me, but I'm so glad he said it, peace is not technical. And I think one of the major critiques which is made, I think quite rightly, of Santos's peace process, which was very, sophisticated and was a huge and important achievement on many levels, it has been accused of being perhaps too technical, too much of the toolbox of the liberal peace model, and believing that peace can be programmed through a sort of a roadmap, the opposite of Jazz's approach to making peace, perhaps perhaps a Bach mathematical fugue approach. But maybe I'm pushing the music metaphor slightly too far. But anyway, all of the moving parts, which are not just national, but also international, involving actors across the region in Latin America, as we've heard from Ivan, and much more from the UK than perhaps we realise here at Oxford, and other countries in Europe and the US, as we've heard from Jeremy. Peace is political, and that includes international geopolitics. I think another reflection I leave here today is the importance of how we interpret things. And, Jenny put that on the point from the beginning. There are many lenses with which to look at this problem. All of them are important. All of them are incomplete. We will never have the whole picture. Petro certainly doesn't have the whole picture. Nobody in Colombia does. But in trying to see all of these different lenses, we can come at the problem with a greater accuracy and understanding of the complexity. And finally, I think that Jenny ended on something that's really important, that also Andre touched on in his talk, and that's the extraordinary capacity that is in Colombia, in civil society, but also in many sectors of the public sector, the business sector, the armed forces, the religious sector, the media. There is an incredible capacity which, for people like myself, and I know Ivan, Jenny and Jeremy, you'll also, I'm sure, agree with me, for non-Colombians working on Colombia, it's something that makes it an incredibly inspiring country to work with and on, because of the degree of sophistication and commitment and courage that so many people in Colombia working in different positions have. But of course, as Andre said, you need them all to work together towards an agreement, to work more in the same direction, to make some of these prospects for peace become reality. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you for staying with us. Please do join us and the speakers afterwards for drinks in the foyer just out here. I'm sure they'll be very happy to answer more questions that I didn't allow them to finish on before. Thank you very much.